Hi guys, this is my gym. I'm gonna show you my routine during the weekend. I hope you like it.
G'day everyone, welcome back to the channel. So as you've probably seen already, today's video is going to be a little bit different to some of the content that we've been putting out prior. I was browsing through sort of YouTube the other day and I came across a channel, and I'll link that channel in the description below. They posted a video of Cristiano Ronaldo, and he was doing a workout at home, just going through some basic exercises, just to work all the different sort of muscle groups, doing a good thing for his followers and his supporters. Now, Cristiano Ronaldo, is one of possibly the best athletes in world sport at the moment, let alone world football. So it often sounds a bit strange when we start talking about what we're about to talk about. So I want to preface this by saying that I have much respect for him as an athlete. He's clearly amazing. Some of the things he can do, even in this video, there's one thing that he does in terms of jumping where he just hovers. He just looks immaculate from an athletic perspective, and my eye goes to good athletes and mechanics and things like that, and I can say without a shadow of a doubt he's very good. But I guess one of the reasons why I got a little bit excited to make a video like this is because the way that he was doing some of the exercises that he highlights, if they're a true representation of how he would do them normally, and he goes through them relatively quickly, but if they in any way represent how he moves when he does these normally, then he's actually missing a bunch of athletic potential. Despite how good he is, the way that he does some of these exercises aren't optimal. We can optimize them further, and as a physical therapist, if we're trying to decrease someone's risk of injury, make them a more robust athlete, improve their function and their performance, there's a few little tweaks that we can make to some of these exercises that hopefully you at home can take and put into practice yourself. They can have a huge positive ramification for your athletic potential and your ability to buffer injury. So I guess, as I said, one of the things that I see a lot clinically is we get really good athletes who can potentially be the best at something, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're the best version of themselves. And this may be the case with Cristiano Ronaldo. So the exciting thing is that despite how good he is, if he was able to improve on these exercises and how he does these exercises, and sometimes that requires a slight technical tweak or some extra mobility in certain areas, then he's potentially not even at his best. He's not even functioning as best as he possibly could athletically. So it's a really positive thing. So I fully understand that these videos can come across as more of a negative dig at someone when you say, look, they're not doing this correctly, they're not doing this very well. But I thought it'd be a great way to, I guess, to turn this into more of a positive and say, well, look, here's one of the best athletes in the world. Here's how I think that they can do each particular exercise better, so that you at home can then do the exercise as best as you can and get the benefits from that. So again, if you do enjoy the video, please leave a like below, and if you consider subscribing as well, it really does help this video get out to more people, and it really does help support the channel, so it would be much appreciated. So without further ado, let's get into it.
Okay, first exercise is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
All right, so with the first exercise here, it's a forward lunge basically. And one of the interesting things that Ronaldo does, and it's only minor here, is when he does the lunge, he continues a lot of his forward momentum. And what we often see is when we do a lunge, we really want to make sure that the knee doesn't track too far over the foot. In an ideal world, we want to keep it relatively vertical, because what happens is when we take a step out and come forwards, we're getting a lot of forward shear through the knee. And if you have a meniscal issue, if you have some issues with your kneecap or your patellar tendon, if you have some arthritis or anything like that, the more forward your knee comes, or the less vertical your shin is, the more load that goes through your knee and less through your hips and thigh. So again, I couldn't do this as good as Ronaldo could, but if I take a step forward, we almost want to sit down on the lunge more than anything. So instead of coming forwards, even though the name of the exercise is a forward lunge, we're going to take a step forward and drop down before coming back up again. And again, this trains the hip to function better, and it can translate a lot more to running and jumping and doing a lot of the things that we want to do. So again, a vertical shin more so than a forward shin, and even his trunk, instead of being vertical, it does sort of hinge forward a little bit more than potentially he could.
3 laps. In that way as well, like 1, 2, jump. 1, 2 it, jump. 1, 2 it, jump. 1, 2, jump.
Okay, so the next exercise is pretty much following on from the first forward lunge exercise. And Ronaldo is basically doing a side lunge, coming back and then jumping. And again, when he jumps, it's a thing of beauty. At least the first jump to me, it just looks like he hovers there for a second. So he's such a good athlete to watch. So basically what we want to see with this is there's 2 things, I guess. So one with the lunge is that when he lunges to the side, he doesn't drop down very deep. So what it basically looks like is when he comes out to the side, he only does, a slight sort of knee and hip bend. What we want to promote when you do a lunge is we want to make sure that you get down as low as your range of motion allows, because we want to train your strength and your ability to control that movement through whatever range of motion that you have. So just doing it to a particular, maybe a halfway point still helps, but it misses all this extra depth, so that when you come up again and jump, and Ronaldo does this really well, but just to point this out for other people, is we want to make sure that your knees don't track inwards. And what you'll see briefly with Ronaldo is his knees stay relatively strong throughout. But what we want you to do even more so is we want to make sure that your knees are as wide as they can possibly be to take full advantage of your rotational stability and your ankle mobility as well. So this position basically is a much stronger shape than a mid-range knee position. And again, when you're jumping and landing, one of the things we see, if that knee caves in a lot, it can set you up for some knee dysfunction, also some Achilles and ankle dysfunction as well.
10 or 20, as I told you before. You do it like that, you open the arms, you do it like that. If you feel that you don't have power enough in your arms, you do it with bend over, with the knees. You do it like that. I think it's good. 20 or 10.
All right, so for the third exercise, what we see Ronaldo do is a push-up. And again, he looks very strong, very powerful when he does a push-up. But he highlights a common mistake that I see clinically in terms of the position of his elbows. Now, a lot of the debate around a push-up often comes back to the depth and what constitutes a full push-up. But I guess the more important thing from a physical therapy and a functional perspective is the position of those elbows. Now, the traditional push-up, basically, how that looks for a lot of people is when we do the push-up, we often see that the elbows come out, the elbows flare. And what that does is that puts the elbow the shoulder in a less stable position. So similar to the hip, where if your feet are straight and you rotate your knees out, it creates that rotational stability at the hip. The same thing happens at the shoulder. So we want to train that in a push-up. And how that looks is, instead of a push-up having the elbow or the crease of the elbow pointing inwards, we want to rotate that arm around so that the elbows, or the inside of the elbow is pointing forwards, the back of the elbow is pointing back. And what you hopefully see with my shoulder is when I create that rotation, it winds the shoulder up into a more steady, stable position, so that when you do a push-up, what we often see is that the elbow tracks more back than it does out to the side. And once you've trained this into yourself, you should feel that this position is less strong than this position. That rotation that you create at the shoulder winds everything up and accesses that strength and stability. So So your ceiling for, say if you're doing a bench press, which is the same position but on your back, your ceiling for the amount of weight you can push is lower from this position than it is from this position, purely because you've got more stability underneath that bar. So it's great in terms to, the push-up is great, sorry, to train that rotational strength into your shoulder, decreasing your risk of injury and obviously improving the function of that shoulder as well.
So I recommend the beginning. This is my daughter, no problem. She interrupted me, but it's okay. It's part of my life. So just once. And then you can do this one or that one, the basic ones. You understand? So you do the basic, or just you do it like that. I recommend in the beginning series of 10, but do it 2-3 times. Okay? So be like that.
Alright, so the next exercise is a sit-up. And again, when Ronaldo lifts that shirt up, he's clearly done a lot of sit-ups, he's clearly good at them, he's got a great set of abs there. Anyone would want that. So from a physical therapy perspective and a functional perspective, I don't have too many issues with how he does them. He obviously gets his neck involved a bit. He maybe doesn't go through full range of motion. He tends to do sort of half reps a lot. But in terms of the actual exercise itself, there's not too many things that I would say he needs to do to improve that exercise. But the important thing to talk about with a sit-up is just to question its role in functional exercises. It's probably not an exercise that you probably need to do to become a better athlete. It's probably more of an exercise that you would do for vanity reasons, or again, if you just wanted to have that washboard ab for whatever reason. The spine and the lower back function best in a neutral position with that core stability over the top. Now, just doing a sit-up, it generally just makes you good at doing sit-ups. So if you want to get out of bed really well, get up from lying on your back really well. Apart from that, there aren't too many functional benefits from being really good at flexing your spine in that way. If you had a choice between a sit-up and a plank, which Ronaldo gets to in a little bit, you probably want to choose the plank every day, just because that'll have much better ramifications for the health and function of your spine. So if you're wanting to become a better athlete, if you have any form of back pain, any hip issues, any pelvic problems, any abdominal issues, the sit-up probably isn't necessarily your first choice exercise. Again, you probably want to default more to a plank, but again, you can't fault the results he's got from them.
Over and knee in front, push, push, push. Front, push, push, push. Understand? I think this is a good one for the bum. Okay.
So the next exercise is a really interesting one. So when we see Ronaldo do those hip extensions, piggybacking off of the concept that we just touched on with the sit-up, the spine functions best when it's in a neutral position. And what you may see if you watch Ronaldo do this is when he's doing this hip extension exercise, his lower back is bending and flexing a lot. Now, what the two things wrong with this basically is that not only is he putting a lot of load and stress through his lower back, but it takes a bit of the shine off the amount of work his glutes will do. So in a perfect world, we want to make sure that that low back is nice and still, and we want to take that hip up to the point where you feel like you start to bend your back. So we want to work within that comfortable range of motion so that your glutes and hamstrings are the only things that are doing the work. Now, if you struggle to get into a good position and you feel like your back's involved too much, it may suggest that your hip flexors are very tight at the front, which means that you can't extend past that. So you have to use your back to make up the difference. So for Ronaldo, again, that may not necessarily be how he moves all the time, but if that reflects his movement habits and movement patterns in any way, it may suggest that he has some hip tightness. And again, in an exercise he does towards the end, it may become a little bit more apparent. But he's got core strength there, but he may not necessarily be able to use it if his hips are stopping him from extending really well. and that back tends to be the thing that moves the most. So if you have any form of back pain again, any hip issues, it's an exercise that you want to make sure that you're really keeping that spine still, just quietening down that activity and moving that hip backwards and forwards in a really safe space so that the hip's doing the work and the back's not contributing.
And do it like that 10 times or 20.
So the next exercise that Ronaldo does is one of my favorite exercises, which is the squat. And interestingly for him, and again, this may not be a representation of how well he does them normally, but he looks very strong. But he also makes a common mistake that a lot of people still make when they squat. And that's basically that there's no depth. And not only that, but the position that his knee in may not necessarily express normal motion as well as it could. And I'll show you what I mean by that. So basically when we see Ronaldo squatting, he does what most people do, is he squats down to an okay position. And because he's doing them pretty quickly, there's no real depth in that squat. But what we know from a mechanical perspective is that normal ankle range of motion, normal hip range of motion, and knee range of motion dictate that you should be able to get to the bottom position of the squat fine. Because we want to train your strength and your mobility through the entire range. Similar to the lunge, if we're not getting deep into this position, we're not training the hip at its full capacity, we're not training the knee and the ankle, and we can sort of set it up for failure at some point. So the important thing with this is we have our feet straight, we want to rotate those knees out, again, create that rotational stability at the hips, rotational stability at the ankles, put the knee in a good position, loads up the VMO, and we want to get to that position where you feel comfortable squatting deep. And what we see with him as well is that when he does squat, his knee's sort of in a mid-range position. So it doesn't track inwards, which shows that he's obviously very strong, he's very well conditioned, but it's also not out as far as possible either. Now again, this could just be a cueing thing. He may not necessarily have thought to do that. He might be able to do it if we asked him to. But if he can't, then that highlights something potentially that we saw in the extension exercise where he may have some hip restriction there. He may even have some ankle stiffness as well. It might not allow him to get into a better position. And the interesting thing, I guess, again, we're drawing a lot from the video, but he has shoes with a thick heel. And if you follow these videos, you know that any heel is that amount of ankle range you don't get to use. So over time, if you're in that shoe for a while, you may not use that deeper ankle range and then you can lose it. So we can see that potentially exposed when you're trying to squat, but not being able to get down as deep as someone could potentially. So if the way that he squats is the best way that he can squat, then the great news is that with a bit of extra mobility through his ankles and hips and a little bit of extra input into the control of that movement, he's got more levels to climb in terms of his ability to be agile, to hover when he jumps, crazily enough. His strength, his speed, all those sorts of things is potentially as good as he is at the moment with a huge handbrake on. So it's a big one. So if you're squatting a lot at home, remember to keep those feet straight, those knees out, and drop as deep as you feel comfortable before you have to compensate for that. And then as you get more mobile, you'll be able to drop down deeper.
So I'm going to do it all exercise. So 10, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Let's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. If you feel good, touch your knee. 10 more. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
So with the next exercise, Ronaldo goes through a plank. And again, watching him plank, he looks very strong through his core. He looks like he's done this a lot before. So there's nothing really to pick apart in terms of his ability to do it. His bottom's not up, his hips aren't down, he's relatively still. And he takes it up a notch by doing some movements with his arms and legs. And the one thing that I wanted to sort of draw your attention to for him is again a potential lack of hip range of motion, because what we see when he's in a position and he starts including his sort of hip flexion here, when he gets to about 90 degrees and his knee comes up higher, his back starts to go with it. So instead of being able to keep a straight spine and bending that knee as far as possible, he gets to about 90 degrees and then his back starts to bend. And what that means potentially is he doesn't have that extra hip range of motion to keep his back straight. So when he needs more hip range of motion for the purpose of the exercise, his body needs to draw that lower back into the movement. So we see this a lot with a lot of back pain patients where a lack of hip flexion or a lack of hip range of motion forces the back to compensate, and then over time that can become a problem. So again, to make that a more sort of elite exercise, we want to try and get some hip mobility into that so that he can keep his back straight and get his knee further past that 90 degrees. But for the purposes of this exercise and for him today, keeping his back straight, he probably wouldn't want to come past that 90 degrees and start to lose that spinal shape. So he should just stay within that range of motion so that back stays still, get full benefit from the core strength of that exercise and the extra benefit of moving the hip as well.
Can you do it? 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. You rest, 10 seconds, and you do it again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10.
Alright, so with the final exercise that he goes through, again, there's not a lot to pick apart with the lumbar extension. Those muscles down the back don't get used a lot. The only thing I would touch on with that is that he does tend to use his neck a little bit. We want to make sure, again, if you're somebody who does this exercise, you can have your hands behind your back. It may also help to have your hands behind your neck so that when you do that, it sort of helps keep your neck out of the equation a little bit more. And look, from a physical therapy perspective, it's really hard to optimize that exercise because it looks pretty good to begin with. But again, if you have any neck issues, it's just something to be aware of going forwards.
So this is what I do every time. I hope you enjoyed my videos.
All right, guys, so I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you found the insights really interesting. Again, Ronaldo's a brilliant athlete. You know, I can't fault how good he is, but we can always ask the question of can he get a little bit better? And hopefully you guys can too. So thanks again for watching, and until next time, we'll see you later. Bye.
Take care, guys. Bye.